Good morning everybody, and welcome to this second day of the conference. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Martin Rösel. Martin Rösel is Professor of Hebrew Bible at University of Rostock and Professor Extraordinary at Stellenbosch University, South Africa. He is President of Editorial Committee of the Biblia Hebraica Quinter Project and of the series The Septuagint and Concordant Studies of the SBL. Today is paper, the title is God and His Action in the Greek Pentateuch. Please.
In their invitation to this fine conference, the organizers have formulated, quote, all presentations of the conference will deal with questions of continuity and discontinuity in the God speech of early Jewish texts. Given this explicit expectation, I would like to begin with two sections that deal with the problem of continuity and discontinuity. And at the same time, they give an introduction into the problem of how God and the gods were translated in the early Septuagint. I will start with Deuteronomy 4:2, and we have similar formulas in Deuteronomy 13 and 13:1, for example. I'm quoting the Greek translation. Here there are no important differences between the versions. You shall not add to the word I command you, and you shall not take away from it. Keep the commandments of the Lord your God, with which I command you today. This famous admonition not to alter the Torah, in German the Kanonsformel, tries to establish the principle of continuity in the tradition as early as in the legislation at Mount Horeb. This requirement, together with its various parallel texts, has been remarkably successful, as it has ensured a very accurate transmission of the biblical text over the centuries, right up to the methods of the Masoretes. One can also assume that the Septuagint's distinctive style of translation has one of its roots here, since most translations adhere very closely to their Hebrew sources and rarely add or take away anything. And as you all might know, the letter of Aristeas is alluding to this formula when it states in paragraph 311, since the exposition has been made well, piously and accurately in every respect, it is good that it remain just as it is, and there be no revision at all. Continuity and Septuagint belong together. Moreover, for readers educated in Greek, this formulation resembles an important definition in Aristoteles' Nicomachean Ethics, that it is, quote, a common remark about a perfect work of art that you could not take from it nor add to it. Thus, the Bible could be seen as an unchangeable, perfect word of art, like the whole creation, and in Ben Sira 18:6, we have a similar formulation, now not on the Bible, but on the whole of the creation. You cannot add something or change something. A few lines further in Deuteronomy 4, this is 4:7, the next text, one can see the other aspect of our topic, a small but important element of discontinuity in the textual tradition. In the Hebrew, it says, for what great nation is there that has gods so near to it as the Lord our God whenever we call on him? While the Hebrew text speaks about gods in the plural, in the context of other people, the Greek translation uses the singular for what sort of great nation has a God for itself. So when Elohim had to be rendered, the translator faced the decision of either retaining the plural or using the singular. This decision had to be made based on the context. Usually the singular was chosen when the text was about the sole God of Israel, and the plural for the gods of the nation. Interestingly, the situation here is reversed. The Old Greek has chosen the singular for the foreign god, perhaps to strengthen that the God of Israel is the one who comes near. Linguistic and theological considerations coincide here. And this may be illustrated by another example from the famous Song of Moses. Okay, sorry about that. Here it is, 32:31. In the Hebrew text it says, "Indeed, their rock is not like our rock, even our enemies themselves judge this." The Greek has, "For not like our God are their gods, but our enemies are without understanding." The situation here in Deuteronomy 32:31 is a bit more complex than in 4:7. One factor is that the metaphorical designation of God being Israel's rock or stronghold was rendered by the translator of Deuteronomy by Theos, in the Psalms by Boethos, helper. This may be the result of the translator's strict sense of reality to come to a comprehensible Greek text, as Martin Meiser has put it. But here we have as a second factor the decision to translate the singular tsuram, their rock, by the plural hoi theoi auton, their gods, which is not motivated by an ambiguous form like Elohim. This achieves a stricter distinction between Israel's God and the foreign gods. It may also have motivated to translate Pelilim, judges, plus agressif, more aggressive, as Cécile Donnier and Marguerite Ahl have formulated. The other people, contrasted by de, do not accept that the God of Israel is superior, they are simply foolish. Thus, the meaning of the verse has changed, or was changed considerably. A similar interpretation can be seen a bit later in verse 37. You have the text. And he will say, "Where are their gods, the rock in which they sought refuge?" And the Lord said, this is the Hebrew in Greek, and the Lord said, "Where are their gods, they in whom they trusted?" Here Elohim was translated by the plural gods, and the metaphor rock was again suppressed and rendered by a relative particle. And again, a bit later in 39, just a moment. 32:39, Elohim was translated by a singular God to formulate a monotheistic statement, "There is no God except me." To summarize this initial approach, translators had to determine in each instance whether the text referred to the God of Israel or to other gods, and how to emphasize this distinction. In some cases, it could be done through the use of singular and plural forms only. In others, ambiguous statements were avoided, such as those referring to God as a rock. And in still other cases, a specific derogatory lexeme, such as eidolon, idol, was chosen for the rendering. You have Numbers 25:2 as an interesting example. For they invited the people to the sacrifices of their God in the Hebrew, in the Greek, and then they invited them to the sacrifice of their idols. I've chosen these examples, my next chapter. I've chosen these examples from Deuteronomy because although its translator adhered very closely to the original text, he produced a Greek text that has its own theological accents. I therefore consider it justified to analyze such differences between the Hebrew and Greek Bibles to describe theological developments in the early Hellenistic era. This applies even when it is not possible in individual cases to determine whether the difference stems from a deviating source text, an ancient reading tradition, or a conscious decision by the translator. Without wishing to reopen the debate on minimalism and maximalism, I consider it productive to adopt this broad approach, especially for a comprehensive topic such as the one addressed at this conference. In my opinion, the Septuagint version of the Pentateuch is particularly well suited for this purpose. It has been extensively researched thanks to the major translation projects of the last decades. It is well known that various translators were involved, each of whom took a different approach to working with their source text. But as we will see, their way of translating converges in some important aspects. The underlying Hebrew text can be assessed based on the parallels in the Samaritan text and the findings from the Judean desert. In the 3rd century, the translators were in an interesting hermeneutical situation. On the one hand, they were likely working shortly after the final editorial revisions had been made in Israel to many books that would later become part of the canon. On the other hand, they lived in Alexandria in a comparatively open atmosphere of dialogue, yet one in which there was competition with other religions and philosophical schools of thought. This led to processes such as the consolidation of their own identity-forming tradition and, at the same time, the highlighting of significant differences. We have just seen some examples. However, these processes took place within the narrow framework set by the source text. A complete rewriting was out of the question. Instead, the canonical formula from Deuteronomy 4 mentioned at the beginning remained effective in the background. Nevertheless, from the early textual history of the Hebrew Bible, we know of phenomena such as the harmonization of passages, actualizations, explanations, or reformulations of ambiguous terms from the 2nd century on. These developments can, in my view, already be discerned in the Greek Pentateuch, as we will see in a minute. So my next chapter, evaluating God's actions. As we now turn to the question of whether there are theologically significant differences in statements about God's actions, one should recall that the first important distinction can already be observed in the subject of the action. The proper name of a regional deity, like the tetragram or Yahweh, is not used, nor, as in Persian times, a designation with a title such as God of Heaven or Most High. As Robert Hanhardt has rightly noted, the use of Kyrios in the absolute sense makes an enormous claim, since the title Lord was otherwise used with the genitive case only. The actions of this Lord are described in the Greek Genesis and the other books of the Pentateuch essentially in the same way as in the Hebrew version. We have heard that yesterday already. Thus, God does something, Genesis 1, poieo, remember Eberhard's lecture yesterday. God speaks, he sees, he names, and he completes his creation, Genesis 1. According to Genesis 2, he causes rain to fall, he forms, plants, commands, causes sleep, builds the woman from the rib, and goes for a walk, peripateo. There is no hesitation in describing God and his deeds in human terms. This also applies to the much discussed field of anthropomorphism and anthropopathism, but I will not speak about that. The distinctions are rare and subtle, but however, modifications are noticeable when the evaluation of God's act might be problematic, which of course is a modern interpretation. The first text I would like to discuss is the story of Cain and Abel. The Greek version shows several differences to the Hebrew. Where is it gone? Here, okay. I'm reading the the translation of the Hebrew in verse 3. So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground, and the Lord had regarded for Abel and for his offering. The first interesting fact is that the translator had differentiated between kurios and theos. In the Hebrew text, the tetragram is used throughout this passage. The Greek uses kurios in the exposition of the story in verse 3, I've just read it. Both give their offerings to kurios. But theos in verse 4 makes the decision to accept one offering and reject the other. And in the following conversation with Cain, always theos is used, even if the Hebrew has the tetragram. But in verse 13, the translator switches back to kurios when Cain turns to the Lord with his plea, "My guilt is too great for me to be forgiven." Moreover, the translator has rendered the difficult and obviously corrupt verse 7. The Hebrew text is, "If you do well," and then it's nearly untranslatable, and you have lifted something up. "If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it." This is probably the meaning of the Hebrew. The Greek has, "If you offer correctly, but do not divide correctly, have you not sinned? Be still, his recourse is to you, and you will rule over him." So the translator has rendered this obviously corrupt text in verse 7 in such a way as to provide an explanation for God's seemingly unjust preference of Abel's offering. He has not divided correctly and therefore sinned. And therefore, a divine punishment may be acceptable, and a plea to the friendly Lord, kurios, can make this more bearable. This is verse 14. As I have proposed elsewhere, the translator or its community in Alexandria made an attempt to understand why the biblical accounts used different designations for God. The solution is to use kurios when referring to the merciful God of Israel, that is, as the standard translation of the Tetragrammaton. Theos, on the other hand, was used when the text described God's mighty, punitive, or seemingly unjust acts. There are quite a lot of texts where this pattern can be discerned. For example, in the book of Genesis, in the flood story in 6:6, in Genesis 12, where Pharaoh is punished because of Sarah. In 13:10, God, not kurios, destroyed Sodom. In Genesis 38, 7 and 10, where and Onan are killed. Similar renderings can be discerned in the books of Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Furthermore, the distinction between the kurios aspect and the theos aspect of God was also applied to the distinction between Israel and the nations, so that theos was used, for example, when Pharaoh or Balaam spoke, even if the Hebrew text contained the Tetragrammaton. This became influential in the history of reception because similar distinctions between the names of God can be found in Philo and in rabbinic literature. The number of texts in which this pattern can be found is so large that the phenomenon cannot be explained by variance in the Hebrew Vorlage. But I have to admit that not all instances fit this pattern. The texts were not consequently revised or rewritten, rather, they were modified in certain instances. However, this reluctance to associate God with acts of violence or with strange acts is also evident in other texts. Some examples, we have Exodus 4:24 here. Oops, here it is. This is when God came to Moses. Now it came about at the lodging place on the way that the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. In the Hebrew text, in the Greek, it is now it happened on the way at the lodging, an angel of the Lord, Angelos Kyriou, met him and was seeking to kill him. The translator of Exodus, or its Vorlage, added Angelos, Malach, to avoid the statement in Exodus 4 that the Lord wanted to kill Moses. In Leviticus 23:30, the first singular was avoided in the Lord's threat, I will destroy him from his people. A passive form was used instead. You have it here, apoleitai, psyche, keine, that soul shall be destroyed. Yeah. Similarly, in Leviticus 26:33, the notion that God draws his sword and destroys Israel is avoided through an impersonal translation. Now, the sword is the subject, and you I will scatter into the nations, and the dagger coming by surprise will utterly destroy you. That's a translation from Netz. To sum up this paragraph, while God's actions can be described in the very same way as those of human beings, different standards apply when it comes to evaluating them. One might surmise that statements such as the so-called formula of grace, we heard about that yesterday in Exodus 34:6, which identify mercy and kindness as essential aspects of God's nature, served as a basis for this development. My next paragraph, God is not like man. If the translators had an idea of which actions are appropriate for God and which are not, the question arises as to whether this is also reflected in other contexts. First and foremost, we should look at the important passage from Numbers 23 in Balaam's second oracle. In the Hebrew it is, God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should repent. Has he said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not make it good? The Greek version harmonizes the first two lines by using anthropos instead of the differentiation between Ish and Adam, man and human. In both lines, hos is added, God is unlike any person. And the verbs are rendered by a passive infinitive showing how the deity is not to be perceived. This leads to a statement that is essential to the image of God in the Greek Bible. It emphasizes the fundamental difference between God and humans more strongly. At the same time, even the idea is deleted that God could lie. Instead, his power is emphasized. This fundamental difference also led to the avoidance of statements in which people such as Joseph in Genesis 50:19, you have the text here, but Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for I am in God's place. That's the Hebrew in the Greek. And Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for I am God's. Just the genitive is used. And similar in Exodus 4:16, the Hebrew has, moreover, he shall speak for you to the people, and I shall come about, that he shall be as a mouth for you, and you shall be as God to him. This is between Moses and Aaron. And in the Greek we have, and he shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, but you shall be to him the things pertaining to God, ta pros ton theon. The translators have thus sought to linguistically highlight the fundamental difference between God and humanity. Finally, I will look up how this is also evident in a central concept regarding the relationship between humanity and God. I'm referring to the interconnected themes of God's dwelling and his appearance. It is well known that the Greek Pentateuch avoids stating that God dwells on earth. A classic example is Exodus 25:8. You have it here, where the Israelites are told to build a sanctuary for God so that God may dwell there. V'shachanti betocham, and I will dwell among them or in their midst. According to the Septuagint, however, God intends to appear there of tesomai and hermin. This shifts the concept from one of permanent accessibility to one of temporary presence only. In Exodus 29:45, the reference to dwelling, shachan, is again avoided. Instead, it states that the Israelites are to call upon God there. Instead, I will dwell among the sons of Israel. I will be invoked among the sons of Israel and will be their God. Similarly, in Deuteronomy 33:16, God does not live in the bush, again, shachan, seneh, but he appears there. And in 12:11, even the statement that God's name dwells at the holy place is avoided. His name is to be invoked at the holy place. You have a similar text in 33:16. Again, shachan is translated by oftenti. This also applies, for example, to God's glory, which, according to Exodus 24:16, you have the text here, does not dwell on Mount Sinai, but descends there. The preceding kata is also important here. Instead of vayishkon, we have kai kat ebe hedoxa tuteu. And this preposition kata is important as it signals a spatial movement down from heaven. Obviously, as Larry Perkins and others have noted, this theological adjustment has further consequences, because in Exodus 36 and 16, also the idea is avoided that Moses can encounter God. Instead, God makes himself known in the sanctuary. And this has led to the phenomenon that in all cases, the notion of the tent of meeting, the Ohel Moed, was translated by tent of witness, kene tu martyrio. You have it here in Exodus 30:36, an important modification of the idea of the temple. And again, it is not about a permanent presence, but the possibility to have short, temporary contact. I come to my conclusion. The examples I've presented so far show that the translators had a clear understanding of the possibilities and limitations of speaking about God and his actions. It is not possible to determine with certainty whether the differences between the Hebrew and Greek can be attributed to intentional interventions by the translators, or whether they simply reflect what was common thought within the Jewish Hellenistic community. Ultimately, these minor changes to the text result in an image of God that is modified in various respects. Here, considerations regarding anthropomorphism and anthropopathism could also be addressed, what I've not done. In this regard, I would like to refer to Ellen de Donker's excellent dissertation that was supervised by Hans Ausloos. In her examination of the relevant terms, she arrived at very similar conclusions. She identified a multitude of small adjustments made during the translation, such as the use of compound verbs. She refers to this as a, quote, prefix theology, through which spatial and temporal dimensions of God's deeds are signaled. This also accurately summarizes my thoughts on God and his actions in the Greek Pentateuch. Many thanks for your kind attention.
So let's move to the second paper of the day. And I'm delighted to introduce Hans Ausloos. Hans Ausloos is professor at Université catholique de Louvain, where is also research director of the Belgian Fund for Scientific Research. He is also director of the Research Center Septuagint Studies and Textual Criticism. The title of his intervention today is God as Gravedigger, Reflection on God's Acting in Deuteronomy 34. Thank you very much, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation to participate at this conference. When Professor Rösel has given a real kaleidoscope of texts, I will try to focus on one single text, one single verse in the Old Testament, dealing with God as a gravedigger. Maybe it's a bit unrespectful that I call him that way. He's not called that way in the Bible itself, but at least it's how he can be presented in the text. When we have a look, we're dealing about the text that deals with the death and the burial of Moses. And speaking about this death and burial of Moses, it has been announced several times in the book of Numbers, 27, 31, the Lord is saying to Moses, "You shall be gathered with your forefathers," announcing the death of Moses in 27, in 31, and also in Deuteronomy 32, "Go up to the Mount Nebo, which is in the land of Moab, over against Jericho, and there you have to die there." So it's an imperative. It's quite strange that you have to die. It seems to be something that you can decide yourself, according to this text, and there you shall be gathered. But the most important text, of course, is Deuteronomy 34, verses 1 to 8, where we read this account of the death and the burial of Moses. Moses went up from the plains of Moab onto the mountain of Nebo, and there God is showing the promised land, not only the promised land as seen the Jordan, the Transjordan party, but also the Transjordan party is considered as part of the land. And so Moses is doing that. He looks over the promised land. And in verse 5, we read how Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab. And at least according to the King James Version that I quote here, he dies according to the word of the Lord, Alpi Adonai, and he buried him, Oto Vayikbor, that's the Masoretic text, in a valley of Moab. Moab was not sick, he was not blind, he was in very good health, 120 years old, not suffering from his eyes. It's still the Moses as we see him here, and each time when I come in Rome, I try to say hello to the Moses of Michelangelo. So that was how he undoubtedly felt when he was dying. So that's the text according to the King James Version. We will start with verse 6, and maybe when time is left, and I hope so, we will do it in a very logical order, also say some words about verse 5. So we'll start with the 6th verse. This text is a very important text, not only within the context of the historical critical analysis of the Bible. It's on the basis of this text that the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch has been reacted against, but that's not the topic of this talk. When we have a look to Deuteronomy 34, verse 6, as most of you already know, our students are no longer that good with Hebrew and Greek, so we can have a look to some translations. And that's also and always interesting to have a look at Bible translations, because even in translations we can see where we have to look for the problems within the biblical text. And so, with regard to chapter 34, verse 6, I have some different translations. And we can see some different interpretations of this rather easy Hebrew text. According to the word of the Lord, Moses is dying, and he buried him. That's the King James Version. Now we have to know the King James Version is not making use of the capital when speaking about God. So this he can be God. It's not the capital is used, but it also can be a human being. We cannot know it from this text. When we compare it with, for example, the New Life Version, and I took some random biblical translations, we can see that the one who buried Moses has a capital. So it's God. It's he who buried him in the valley. I also asked ChatGPT to make a translation. It was just for fun. To make a translation of the Hebrew text, and of course ChatGPT was making use of other translations. ChatGPT also was suggesting that he, with a capital, has been burying Moses. That's one category, he. Second category, as for example, the New International Reader's Version, Moses dies, just as the Lord has said, and then the Lord buried the body of Moses. Or, in the Wycliffe Bible, the Lord buried him. And here we can see something what a good Bible translation not has to do, that's adding some words. So the Lord is added here, that's added here, it's not in the Hebrew text. So the tetragram is added in a translation. So we have to be hesitant in doing that. That's a second category. A third category, as for example, the New International Version, Moses dies, and he buried him, or between brackets, he was buried. So it's becoming a passive form. As the new RSV, the Catholic edition at least, is doing, he was buried in a valley. A passive form. When we have a look to the Hebrew text, we can see, and when we make abstraction of the Masoretic vocalization, which we sometimes have to do, we can see that some different interpretations are possible. You can vocalize it as a kal, third person, singular, vayikboch, and he buried. It's a quite easy form, grammatically spoken. It's not complicated. And then he buried him. The question arises, who buries him? Because no subject is made explicit in the text. He died according to the word of the Lord, and he buried him, so we can suppose it's the Lord, but it's not made explicit. Another possibility, and that's not uncommon for the kal construction, is that it's an impersonal construction, and as far as I know, no English translation is translating the text as such. Someone buried Moses. That's a good translation of this third person, and an article by Rabin has been written in 1962, as for example also can be seen in the second book of Kings, Vayikboch Oto, so someone buried King Ammon. King Ammon died and someone buried him. So it's not the Lord, it's someone. He was buried. No, it's not passive. It's someone who is burying him. Or in Joshua 24, where a plural form is used, Vayikboru Oto. Joshua died and they buried him. Someone buried him. So that's also a possibility, a fourth possibility, maybe. Another possibility, from a grammatical perspective, is that Moses buried himself. You're laughing, but we will see that in rabbinic tradition, this has been used. Reference has been made to this grammatically construction, Gesenius Couts. Rarely, it's not often, it's not common, but it can be used that way. Only when marked emphasis is intended is the accusative of the reflexive pronoun represented by the nota accusativa et with a suffix. The problem here, from the content seen, is that Moses, he dies and then he buries himself. So that's quite different. Moses he has a lot of capacities, but if that's possible, that's something else. So in the context, it's not easy to understand. And then there is that other possibility, when we make abstraction of the Masoretic vocalization, is that we vocalize this vayikbor, this verbal form, not as a kal, but as a nifal. And that's possible. So that we say the Masoretes, they didn't understand it correctly, but it has to be vocalized as a third-person singular nifal, and then we have a passive form. He was buried, as some of the translations have been doing. I also asked ChatGPT, another one, the equivalent, Claude, and it was giving a translation, and immediately it was giving some annotation saying, verse 6 is ambiguous. The subject is unstated, it said, so it could mean he, the Lord, buried him, or reading it impersonally, that's not impersonal, it's passive, impersonally, Claude was saying he was buried. So, contrary to ChatGPT, Claude is suggesting a passive construction. In Deuteronomy 10, we can see that it's used that way. Aaron died and he was buried, vocalized as a nifal. So it's not impossible. The only problem in Deuteronomy 34 is that nota accusativa. When we vocalize as vayikaber, he was buried, the object is already implied within the verbal form. So what's the function of this auto? So from a grammatical perspective, it's rather strange that it should be vocalized here as a nifal. So what rests is an active interpretation. He buried. But who buried? Who buried Moses? And this brings us to the interpretation of Deuteronomy 34, verse 6. I give some presentations, and the first one is this one, is that by Josephus in his Antiquitates. According to Josephus, Moses disappeared. He disappeared. A cloud stood over him, over Moses, and he disappeared, afanitzetai, in a certain valley, although he wrote in the holy books that he died. So Josephus, he accepts that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. He wrote about himself that he died, but that's not true. That's not true what Moses was writing. He disappeared. But why did he do that? Because of fear that the people would say that because of his extraordinary virtue, he went directly to God. And to avoid that, he wrote about himself that he died. And here, in doing that, Josephus is putting Moses on the same level as Elijah, where the same verbal root is used. Also, Elijah disappeared. Moses disappeared, Elijah disappeared. He just lied in order to mislead the people that he was buried. Second interpretation that was given to this text is that Moses died and was buried by God himself. So we should accept that interpretation, that translation, that you can add the tetragram that God himself, he buried him. As for example, Pseudo-Philo was writing, God himself buried Moses with his own hands on a highland and in the light of the whole world. God himself buried Moses. Or in the Samaritan writing Memer Marka, it is written that 4th century, a righteous one is buried by a king, a priest is buried by a prophet, but Moses, he is buried by God himself. And finally, Rabbah on Devarim, another matter, God said to Moses, all people descend to the grave and their eyes dim. Your eyes did not dim, as Deuteronomy 34 is writing. All the people tend to utensils crafted by flesh and blood, a coffin and so on, but you, it's not a case for you. You, I and my entourage, they tend you. From where is it derived? Is it, as it's stated, he buried him, God buried him in a valley. So Moses did not disappear. No, it was really God who buried Moses. This grammatical possibility that Moses buried himself, also reference is made by Rashi on Deuteronomy 34. Rabbi Ishmael said it means, Deuteronomy 34 means, he buried himself. This auto is one of the three cases of et with a pronominal suffix, which Rabbi Ishmael explained as reflexive and so not as an accusative. So Moses, he entered a cave and there he died. Problem remains, so first he died and then he buried himself. And then there is much literature about Moses who is buried by an angel. And here we can see probably a reaction, probably against a too anthropomorphic presentation of God. God as one, as a gravedigger, as I labeled the title of my presentation, or God as someone who is having contact with a dead body. Maybe that's the background. Therefore, several texts are dealing with Moses who is buried not by God himself, but by an angel. For example, Palaya Historica, Samael, it's one of those strange angels. He attempts to obtain the body of Moses, but an angel, Michael, prevents this and was burying Moses in an unknown grave. Or Lady Egeria, when she came in Moab, I asked those holy men what a slightly raised spot within a small church on top of Mount Nebo was, and they answered, here lies the holy Moses, led here by angels. Moses was buried by angels. And this tradition apparently also can be seen in the epistle of Jude, where reference is made to the archangel Michael, who contended with the devil and he disputed about the body of Moses. So we have the impression that it's also one of the angels who buried Moses. So that with regard to the reception, how one has dealt with this problematic text, who buried Moses, that this rather easy grammatical form we have in Deuteronomy 34. When we look now to the textual witnesses of Deuteronomy 34, verse 6, we can see that there are some problems. There are some different textual witnesses. This is a screenshot of McCarthy's BHQ, where we can see that Vayikbor, the Masoretic text, can be found in the Samaritan Pentateuch, in the Masada manuscript of Deuteronomy. I will tell something later about that. The Vulgate, the Peshitta, and some of the Targumim. But that there also is a third plural form, as can be seen in another manuscript of Deuteronomy, in the Greek text, and also in some of the Targumim, which is considered as exegetical by McCarthy. Let's have a look to Deuteronomy 34 in Greek. In Greek, indeed, we have a plural form. It's not he buried, but they buried. Kai etapsan. All manuscripts, except only one single manuscript, has a plural. Only one manuscript has singular form in this. It's 500. And this brings us to the question, why the Septuagint has a plural form. Kai etapsan, auton, and gai. There are some other variants, but we'll not deal with those things. So they buried him in Gai, as Nats is translating. Bible d'Alexandrie, et on l'ensevelit. Not they, but impersonal translation. And that's also possible, because the Greek plural form can be used as an impersonal form in singular. On, donc that this tradition, this translation by Bible d'Alexandrie also is a correct translation. Weavers was saying, according to the Masoretic text, it was the Lord who buried Moses, that this was the original account, that's something else, that this was the original account, is clear from the next clause. It was to avoid the direct statement that the Lord buried him by using an indefinite plural. That was Weaver's interpretation. Septuaginta Deutsch, die Septuaginta wollte den Anthropomorphismus vermeiden, against an anthropomorph presentation of God. Or as Professor Rösel wrote in a recent article in the Septuagint, Moses was not buried by God himself as narrated in Deuteronomy 34:6, Hebrew, but by the people. The translator changed the singular to plural to avoid the notion that God could bury someone. And also in his Deuteronomy commentary on Deuteronomy, Eckhart Otto is writing about eine theologische Korrektur. So the Septuagint is correcting this text. When we have a look to Deuteronomy 34:6 in Hebrew and in Greek, we can see that it's more complex. We have indeed the Masoretic text, as you can see, vayikboch, when we vocalize it that way, singular form. Samaritan Pentateuch is more complex. We have some manuscripts in plural, we have some manuscripts in singular. But all these manuscripts are medieval, so they are quite late manuscripts, and it's difficult to make some conclusions. But then there is the Septuagint, plural. We also have a Hebrew manuscript from Qumran, which also has a plural. 4Q Deuteronomy L. Vayikberu, plural form. And then there is that Masada manuscript, which by McCarthy also is considered as presenting a singular form. But I do not agree with that presentation. And I'll show you what. I'll show you why. This is the manuscript of Masada. You can see in the second last line the verbal form vayikbru, vayikbor. It's presented correctly here by Talmon. But we cannot use it as a textual witness of the singular form. Because when we have a look to the text, and we have the text here, the text of the Qumran manuscript, we can see that here the final resh is only conserved partially. When we take another resh and put it together, and there she goes, you can see that it's probably a singular form, but it also can be a plural form. We don't know. So I don't think we can use this manuscript to say that we have another ancient Hebrew Dead Sea scroll from Masada that is giving an identical reading as the Masoretic text. Actually, this manuscript is useless. For us, it's an important manuscript. I'm not saying that it's not important, but it's useless. It can be a singular, it can also be a plural. So we cannot make use of it, contrary to what, for example, Talmon was doing in order to say that the manuscript of Masada was a real Masoretic text. It was identical with the Masoretic text. No, it's not identical. We cannot use it. It can be singular, it can be plural. So that's what concerns this text of Deuteronomy 34. Was it the Septuagint who changed it? Probably, but we have anyway a Hebrew manuscript, 4Q Deuteronomy L, which also reads a plural form. So probably the plural reading of the Septuagint was based already on a Hebrew manuscript. That's what concerns Deuteronomy 34, verse 6. Acting of God, God as burying, or who is burying? God, someone in plural, someone in singular. The text is not clear. From a grammatical perspective, it's very easy. It's a very easy form, but the interpretation makes this text more complicated. That's not all. We also have to say some words on the foregoing verse, Deuteronomy 34:5. We buried Moses now, so he's buried now. We have to let him die before. And that is done al pi Adonai. He dies al pi Adonai. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, he died in the land of Moab according to the mouthpiece of God. The Septuagint, we see something different. Moses, according to Nets, good translation, Moses died in the land of Moab, not through the mouth, but through the word of the Lord. Not stoma, but rhema. In a recent article, Professor Daniela has dealt with this text as well. And she writes, the Greek translators suppress the anthropomorphism of the mouth, probably because it is perceived as inappropriate, obscure, and requires an explanation. And the reason, if I understand you well, is because of a comparison with the death of Aaron as well, who, in a very interesting article where you deal with the royal decree, that in the Septuagint, both die according to a divine decree, a divine word, and not from a divine word. And then you are making a reference to a divine kiss, a kiss from God's mouth. So not dealing with the mouth, but the mouth is standing for the kiss. Basing on rabbinical tradition. According, among others, the Talmud Baba Batra, Aaron and Moses died with a divine kiss, not at the hand of the angel of the dead. Or the Targum, Moshe gathered by the kiss of the word of the Lord. That could be the background of this rendering of Alpi, mouth by Rhema. So this expression, according to Professor Daniela, this expression divine kiss, is not something invented here, but the literal meaning of the idiomatic expression of Hebrew on the mouth of Yahweh, generally omitted in all modern translations of Hebrew and understood in the sense of on divine order. I agree with the element on divine order, but I'm not that sure about the element of the kiss. Similarly, she says, the Septuagint erases the mouth as part of the body attributed to God, rejects the divine kiss, and replaces it in the Hexateuch with the well-known technical term of Ptolemaic terminology, prostagma in numbers, and rhema in the sense of commandment order. And also my doctoral student, Ellen de Donker, Professor Rösel referred to her, she went in the same trace when she writes in the Septuagint, with diarrhematos curio, no trace of a divine kiss is found, as was the case in Numbers 33. The translator might have avoided a possible image of this divine kiss, as a kiss might have had specific implications and connotations for the translator. Connotations they thought unfit in the translation of this verse. I'm not that sure whether the Hebrew text really is dealing with a kiss. About the translation, it's clear that the translator is not translating in Deuteronomy 34 P by mouth, but by word. I rather think that the Rhema in Deuteronomy 34, or the P Adonai in Deuteronomy 34, as well as in Numbers 33, are not referring to a divine kiss, but very simply to the execution of a divine command. When we look to Deuteronomy 33, moreover, this interpretation of a kiss is quite difficult in the Hebrew text. Aaron went up into Mount Hor and died there. But it's not said in the Hebrew that he dies al pi Adonai, as could be interpreted by a divine kiss. No, the Hebrew text is saying Aaron went up into Mount Hor according to the mouth of Adonai, and he died. So he's climbing the mountain al pi Adonai. So is he climbing because of a divine kiss? That it doesn't function in my view. Deuteronomy, the text is different. There it's Moses is dying according to Pi Adonai. But here, as well as in Numbers, it seems to be an execution of a divine command. In Numbers 33, it refers to Numbers 20, where God says, take Aaron, bring them up onto Mount Hor, strip him of his garments, and there he will be gathered with his people. And then, some chapters later, he is doing according to the word, the commandment of God. He's climbing the mount and he's dying. As God also said in Deuteronomy 32 to Moses, die on that mount. And so in Deuteronomy 34, Moses climbs up the mountain and he dies. So I'm quite hesitant by interpreting these Hebrew terms, this Hebrew text, as referring to a divine kiss. It's rabbinic interpretation. And when the Jewish tradition was not giving that interpretation, certainly the church fathers would have given that interpretation. But I'm not sure whether it was the real meaning of the text. So this brings us then to the interpretation of the Septuagint, where pe has the meaning of the word, rhema. That's the interpretation ad sensum. It's a good interpretation. I don't see an anti-anthropomorphic reaction here in this text. The Septuagint translator seems to give a very faithful rendering of this presumed Hebrew voorlage. As we say in Dutch, but you don't understand Dutch, iemand naar de mond praten, talk to someone's mouth. It's not functioning in English, but it has nothing to do with the mouth. It's talking in the same way as my words. So that's not anthropomorphic, it's just the meaning of this text. And this seems to be confirmed, in my view, by Deuteronomy 8, where the translator of the Septuagint is talking about the mouth of God. Every word that goes through the mouth of God. He could have avoided it here. He could have perfectly avoided the mouth of God. He could have translated, interpreted every word that comes from God. A man shall live, thanks to that word. So the mouth is not necessary, but he had apparently not a problem by translating pe by stomatos. So that with regard to Deuteronomy 34:5, I don't see an anti-anthropomorphic element in this verse. The question of Deuteronomy 34:6 remains complex. And this brings me to my conclusion. The only thing we can say for sure is that Moses is dead. When he once lived. So, who buried him, that remains very problematic. And it remains very problematic, for example, for those editors of the Hebrew Bible, a critical edition, who are trying to make an eclectic edition of the Hebrew text. What should they choose? Singular or plural? A singular can make reference to God. He buried him, but can also perfectly be translated as someone buried him, but we don't know where he's buried. It makes sense in the context. The plural also makes sense. They buried him. You can ask who, because Moses is alone on top of the mountain, but yeah, later someone, they found him and they buried him in the narrative. Or this plural form can also be translated in Hebrew and in Greek as someone. So that's not necessarily a plural. It has to be translated as a plural. In Greek, the same problem or the same solution can be given. The plural form, because almost all manuscripts have a plural form, can be rendered as they or someone. Also in Greek, plural can be used for plural or for singular, impersonal. So all arguments that are given against or for a singular or plural translation, they are all nourished by theological concerns and not by linguistic, not by grammatical concerns of the text, because the Lord cannot touch a dead body, because it's too anthropomorph. So it's all about theology. It's not about the grammatical and linguistic parts of the text. What was the most original reading? I don't know. I don't know. I don't think we can give a definite answer. Different solutions can be given, buried by God and a reaction against this presentation, or buried by a human and reacting against this presentation. No, it was not a human person who buried Moses, but because Moses was the most extraordinary prophet we have, it was God who had to bury him. So he's dead and undoubtedly has been buried, but by whom I cannot give you that answer on the basis of this text. Thank you so much.
Now we have a short paper by Neil Prasanna Fernandopulle. He's a PhD student of the PBI, and he works on the 2 Corinthians under the supervision of Professor Granados. The title of his paper is Paul use of the Septuagint in 2 Corinthians 6:14, 7:1. Divine vocabulary in motion. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Scialabba. Before I begin my presentation, I would like to thank particularly for the organizing committee, Professor Scialabba and the team, especially for giving us, the doctoral students, also an opportunity to participate in this seminar, in this conference and present a paper. Especially I thank my thesis guide, Professor Emmanuel Granados, for supporting me and encouraging me to present this short paper and guiding me through. The theme of the presentation is Divine Vocabulary in Motion, Paul's use of the Septuagint in 2 Corinthians 6:14 to 7:1. This morning we have already seen two papers in which the parallel continuity and discontinuity between Hebrew and Septuagint texts. Now we are moving on to a New Testament text in which we see how the Septuagint text, between Septuagint and the New Testament Greek, the continuity and discontinuity, how Paul uses that. This study examines how Paul draws and reshapes Septuagint language about God in 2 Corinthians 6:14 to 7:1. The passage is well known for its string of scriptural references, often described as a catena. However, what is less frequently analyzed in a sustained way is how the vocabulary referring to God moves across these citations and is reconfigured within Paul's argument. The central claim of this paper is that Paul's use of the Septuagint in this passage shows a significant level of lexical continuity, especially in relation to divine presence and covenantal restoration language. At the same time, this continuity is accompanied by deliberate textual reconfiguration. Paul compresses, combines, and slightly reshapes his sources in order to produce a unified divine voice that directly supports his exhortations in the passage, in his argument. So, the key question is not whether Paul is faithful to his scriptural sources or whether he departs from them. Instead, it focuses on how continuity and a reconfiguration operate together within a shared Greek scriptural register. To guide our discussion, we have four major questions. Which textual form of scripture is reflected in the catena? Where do we observe lexical continuity with the Septuagint? Where and how does Paul intervene in inherited wordings? What is achieved by these adjustments within the argument of the passage? Now we will see some of the textual forms and sources of the scriptural catena that Paul is using here. The catena in 2 Corinthians 6:16 to 18 primarily draws on passages such as Leviticus 26, Ezekiel 37, Isaiah 52, and 2 Samuel 7, and other related prophetic material. The precise identification of sources remains debated, particularly because no single forlag accounts fully for the wordings found here. Scholars have taken different positions. For example, some claim that there are at least 6 prominent scholarly views about the composition of verses 16d. Some argue for dependence on a relatively stable Septuagint text traditions. Others suggest a more fluid use of testimonia or pre-existing collections. A third position emphasizes Paul's own compositional activity, treating the Catena as a constructed unit rather than a reproduced one. 2 observations are important for the present argument. First, the linguistic texture of the passage suggests that it primarily derives from the Septuagint. The vocabulary, syntax, and collocations consistently reflect Greek scriptural usage. The second, the form of the text does not perfectly correspond to any single extended Septuagint passage. This suggests that Paul is not simply copying, but instead engaging with scriptural language as a flexible resource. For the purpose of this study, it is best to speak of a Septuagint register than one particular text. This allows us to account both for continuity and for variation without forcing the evidence into a single model of dependence. Now we see, where do we find the lexical continuity? The analysis of the vocabulary reveals that there is a strong pattern of continuity that is especially visible in 3 clusters of God language. First, we have here divine indwelling and presence, as can be seen in the following table, the slide. Expressions such as enekeso in autois and kaiem peripateso reflect well-established Septuagint formulations of the divine presence among the people. The phrasing, I will dwell among them and walk among them, closely echoes text found in Ezekiel and Leviticus. What is significant here is not only the reuse of the individual terms, but the preservation of a semantic field. Although Paul does not reproduce the Ezekiel and Leviticus text lexically, he preserves their central semantic field of divine indwelling, re-expressing it through a different verbal form. Then we have covenant formulae. The formula, I will be their God and they shall be my people, is one of the most stable expressions in the Septuagint. Its appearance in this passage, even though it is not verbatim with Ezekiel or Leviticus, signals continuity at a deeper level than vocabulary alone. It evokes an entire network of covenantal associations. Paul does not replace this formula with the new language. He retains it, thereby anchoring his argument in a recognizable scriptural formula. Then thirdly, we have the language of divine filiation. The language of I will be father to you and you shall be sons and daughters reflect principal materials associated with 2 Samuel 7:14 and arguably some extension in reference to Isaiah 43:6. Here again, the lexical field is recognizably connected to Septuagint, even if the precise wording shows some expansion. Across these examples, a consistent pattern emerges. Paul's God language is not invented for the occasion. It is drawn from a shared scriptural reservoir and remains intelligible within that tradition. We have seen the continuity between Paul's continuity between the Septuagint and Paul's use of the same versions in his writing, in his argument. Now we shall see some of the reductions that Paul does. Continuity, however, is only a part of the picture. Alongside it, we observe a series of deliberate adjustments. First, we have compressions and conflations. Paul brings together phrases from different scriptural contexts and compresses them into a single catena. We see on this table. Material that originally belonged to distinct historical and literary setting is now presented as a continuous divine utterance. This has two effects. First, it removes contextual boundaries between the sources. Second, it creates the impression of a unified scriptural voice. Then we have lexical adjustments. As already noted, Paul does not reproduce his Septuagint sources verbatim. Instead, his use of scripture is marked by a series of controlled lexical adjustments, including substitution, expansion, and semantic harmonization. These modifications do not compromise the Septuagint character of the language. Rather, they point to a mode of active appropriation. This can be illustrated with several examples. The clause kai emperipatheso corresponds closely to Leviticus 26:12a. By contrast, eneukeso enautois has no exact lexical parallel in either Leviticus 26 or Ezekiel 37. The verb enoikeo is absent from both passages. Its use here, however, is not arbitrary. It maintains clear semantic continuity with the noun kataskenosis in Ezekiel 37:27, thereby preserving the conceptual field of the divine indwelling while recasting it in verbal form. What can be observed, therefore, is not lexical reproduction, but semantic transposition. This pattern is reinforced by prenominal variations too. Although the verbal structure reflects Leviticus 26:12 and shifts from enhumein to enautois, aligns the formulation with Ezekiel's wording. At the same time, in the citation of 2 Samuel 7:14, Paul reverses the direction of the adoption, shifting from third person singular to second person plural in order to address his audience directly. A further instance of expansion appears in the addition of the kai tugateras, which extends the filial expressions beyond its attested scriptural form. These examples suggest that Paul's procedure is neither mechanical reproduction nor free innovation. Rather, his adjustments operates with the semantic and linguistic boundaries of the Septuagint tradition. The result is a rearticulation of inherited God language that remains recognizably continuous with its sources while being carefully aligned with the rhetorical and paranetic aim of the passage. Recontextualization. Perhaps the most significant intervention is contextual. The scriptural language is repositioned within an exhortation that begins in 6:14 and culminates in 7:1. The catena does not function as isolated a theological reflection. Rather, it provides a grounding for Paul's appeal. By presenting the citations as direct divine speech, Paul aligns the scriptural authority with the rhetorical movement of this argument. By bringing together scriptural references from diverse contexts, all originally embedded in covenantal restoration, Paul reshapes them into a single continuous utterance. In this way, the catena supplies the rationale for the exhortation. The Corinthians are to live in accordance with their restored identity, expressed in terms of divine indwelling and the designation of the community as the temple of God. God language in transition, continuity without rupture. We have a continuity and a discontinuity, but continuity without rupture. How should this combination of continuity and reconfiguration be understood now? One life of interpretation emphasizes discontinuity. On this view, Paul's handling of scripture represents a significant shift, even a transformation of earlier God language. Thus, the promise of divine indwelling in Ezekiel and Leviticus, originally addressed to Israel, is now extended beyond its initial ethnic and cultic framework. Similarly, the filial language of 2 Samuel 7, directed to David, and his descendants is recast with a broader scope. Another approach stresses continuity, seeing Paul as largely preserving inherited formulations. The evidence of this passage supports this position. On one hand, the lexical and semantic continuity is difficult to overlook. The language of divine presence, covenant, and filial remains firmly rooted in the Septuagint tradition, where covenant restoration provides the shared framework. On the other hand, Paul's compositional activity is equally evident. He reshapes his material so that it speaks with a single voice within a new argumentative setting, one that reflects his understanding of restoration in God and in Christ. 2 points may be important in the evaluation. First, Paul's adjustments operates with the limits of the scriptural tradition. He does not introduce a new vocabulary for speaking about God, but reorders and reshapes existing expressions. Second, the result is not a rupture but intensification. By bringing these texts together, Paul concentrates their theological force and redirects it towards a specific paradigmatic aim. It is therefore more appropriate to speak of selective emphasis and reconfiguration within continuity rather than replacement or departure. Conclusions and further implications. This paper has argued that Paul's use of the Septuagint in 2 Corinthians 6:14 to 7:1 is characterized by a dynamic interplay between lexical continuity and textual reconfiguration. The Catena preserves a recognizable Septuagint vocabulary of divine presence, covenant, and relationship. At the same time, Paul compresses, rearranges, and slightly adjusts his resources to produce a unified divine voice that supports his exhortation. This suggests that early Christian engagement with scriptural language about God cannot be understood not as a break from Jewish tradition, but as a development within it. The continuity lies in the shared vocabulary and semantic fields. The development lies in how that material is recomposed and redeployed. Further work should be extended this analysis by comparing similar catena elsewhere in Paul, or by examining how these patterns relate to a broader practice of scriptural interpretations in the same period. Thank you.